So yeah, we're coming towards the end of a kind of mini sub-series, a mini-series of talks on these Tuesday nights, and it's been about the tradition in Buddhism called the Mahayana tradition. So we've been looking at over the past few weeks and months really, coming towards the end of that. But just a bit of a recap if anyone hasn't been coming to those talks or has forgotten. So the Mahayana tradition was, well, the name Mahayana means, Maha means great, and Yana means vehicle. So it was a name that was created by the people who begun this tradition. It means great vehicle. And it was in reference to what had come before, which they called lesser vehicle, rather kind of derogatorily. But so the Mahayana, which they regard as being a great vehicle, was you could say a restatement of the Buddha's original teaching. They regarded that the Buddhist tradition had lost sight of the spirit behind the early Buddha's teachings. They restated, in particular, the importance of selflessness and compassion, of practicing for other people. So that was a big part of the Mahayana tradition. And a large part of that is what we call the ideal of the Bodhisattva. And Bodhi means awakening or enlightenment. Sattva means being. So you could say a Bodhisattva is a being who is, all their energies are directed towards awakening, towards enlightenment. But there's more to it than that. Because of the Mahayana context, the Bodhisattva is the being who is dedicated to enlightenment for other people's benefits, for all beings. So it's very much a tradition, very rich in compassion, emphasis on compassion, selflessness, and that being the way to enlightenment, the way to awakening is actually through serving other beings. So this is the area we've been looking at over the past few weeks. In particular, we've had a series of talks on a list, one of these many Buddhist great lists called the 6 Paramitas. And we've been having a series of talks over the past few weeks on the 6 Paramitas. And this evening we'll be having 3 short talks, kind of more personal talks about people's own practice of some of these areas. So yeah, Buddhism has lots of lists and lots of different formulations of what the path might look like, what the Buddhist path might look like. And this is one famous example which comes from the Mahayana Bodhisattva tradition called the 6 Paramitas. So paramita, para means, I think, going, or way, going. And amita means kind of beyond, going beyond. So sometimes these are translated as ways of going beyond suffering, ways of going beyond our current state to enlightenment. So just pause. Perfect. So one translation of paramita is a way to the beyond. Sometimes they're also translated as perfections, 6 perfections, because they relate to qualities of the trainee bodhisattva that they're trying to perfect. They're trying, in a sense, and it's said that the bodhisattva or the enlightened being, the Buddha, would practice these spontaneously and without any kind of conscious thought. So that's the perfection of these. And in a sense, somebody starting out on the path like ourselves will be practicing them in a very day-to-day way, quite a deliberate, conscious way. And that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. There's going to be myself, I'll be talking about ethics, Kate will be talking about energy, and Daniel will be talking about meditation. And it'll be very much, we've looked at the kind of the theory maybe over the last few weeks of these, and this evening we're going to be looking at them in practice, our own kind of personal practice of these paramitas. So I'm going to be talking about ethics. And I thought I'd begin with asking, well, a rhetorical question really, but a question which is, how does one go deeper on the Buddhist path? What is it that we do? If we want to deepen our commitment or to take a next step, what is it that we do in the Buddhist path? And in a few weeks' time, actually, some people will be doing that. We're going to be having a ceremony, an evening at Sangha Night. There'll be some people, I think Martin, Paula, Robin, Tom, some other people, Caroline as well. They're going to be taking the step of becoming what we call mitra, which means friend. And it's a way of kind of making a public declaration that you regard yourself as a Buddhist. And you could say, well, what is required of somebody who wants to deepen that commitment, somebody who wants to... By the way, you'll hear more about that over the next weeks. If you want to find out more about that, you could ask one of the order members about what's involved in that, what that means. But you could say it's a way of deepening commitment to the Buddhist path. So going back to this question, what's involved? How does one deepen commitment? What's involved? Well, an answer is given by what's involved in becoming a mitra, really, because by becoming a mitra, you are saying that you consider yourself to be a Buddhist, but also that you consider your practice of Buddhism to involve trying to keep the 5 precepts, the 5 ethical precepts. So the answer for that question is basically you deepen your commitment with ethics, through deepening your practice of these 5 Buddhist precepts. So hopefully you've all encountered these 5 ethical principles, these 5 precepts at various times. But just to recap what they are, so basically the first precept is the precept of not harming, not taking life. And each of them has got what you might call a negative aspect, which we usually in pujas or rituals will chant in a language called Pali, we'll chant these 5 precepts. So there's an aspect which we avoid, and the first precept is to avoid violence or harming living beings. And then there's also a positive, it's almost like an open-ended practice of the precepts, which is really emphasised more in our tradition. And for this precept, it's the principle of love, which is something open-ended. We can never love. There's no end to how much we can love people. It's open-ended. And the second precept, we try and avoid, in a way, exploitation or taking what's not freely given. And we try and cultivate a spirit of generosity, freely giving, open-handedly giving. And the third precept involves avoiding craving. And in particular, sexual craving is mentioned in the Pali form. But the positive principle that underlies it is contentment, cultivating an inner state of contentment and stillness, which pervades our lives. The fourth precept is truthfulness. So basically avoiding bending, manipulating, spinning the truth, and just or exaggerating, just saying things straightforwardly as they are. A principle of integrity and openness, truthfulness. And then finally, there's the fifth precept: we avoid taking intoxicants, things that will cloud our minds. So specifically mentioned the kind of alcohol, intoxicants, drugs. But it's the principle behind it is becoming more and more aware, having a mind that is clear and radiant, with awareness and mindfulness. That's a quick recap of these 5 precepts. But in essence, if you want to take your Buddhist practice more deeply, it's not about learning, fancy technique in meditation or, trying to, go straight for Buddhist wisdom. Really, if you want to deepen your commitment to Buddhist practice, it involves living by these principles, deciding that you want to live by these principles, act by them, make your behaviour become governed more by these principles. That's what deepening Buddhist practice looks like, really, is becoming more and more conscious and aware of the practice of ethics. So I thought, if looking at the kind of personal aspect of this practice in this talk, what did that look like for me? So I became a mitra a few years ago, and I took to live by these precepts. And initially there were some quite clear things that I wanted to try and change in my life, kind of unskillful habits that I wanted to change. And in terms of harming, I was quite clear actually I wanted to become vegetarian to begin with, and I'd always eaten meat. I'd always enjoyed cooked breakfasts and things like that, sausages, hamburgers. So I thought, it might be quite difficult. It might be difficult to do that. Actually, quite quickly I realised that I was getting more of a sense of connection, a deepening sense of connection with living beings, and to eat an animal just began to feel more and more jarring. Actually, I just felt like I no longer felt comfortable doing that. So quite quickly, eating meat dropped away. There's one lapse where I went to it was a bonfire party at my in-laws, and I was given a pork sandwich, and I felt it felt like I wasn't comfortable enough being a Buddhist in my kind of own skin as a Buddhist to kind of say no to my in-laws. It's quite a new relationship with the in-laws, so I ate the pork sandwich. But I think since then I've never knowingly eaten meat. Another big change in my life, I suppose, early on when I first got involved and decided I wanted to make this deepening commitment, was around getting really drunk, actually, because that was something I'd just done. I was going to say for fun, but it wasn't really fun, actually. I don't really know why I did it, just because that's what people do, and it's what my friends did, and we'd, particularly at university, but then after university, we'd go out in Sheffield, Division Street, West Street to the bars, and basically it got to a stage I was just drinking lots of, as much lager as I could, and then when I was full up with lager, spirits, and I got to a sense where it wasn't really, I became a bit desensitised to alcohol. It wasn't really having an effect on me, and so I think, basically I was drinking too much alcohol. That's what you could say. Having quite stinking hangovers as well. It wasn't good. So again, this part of me always thought, this isn't really what I'm about. This isn't really who I want to be. But I didn't really have a sense of an alternative, I suppose. So in a sense, discovering the 5 precepts gave me an alternative. It gave me a list of ways which actually seemed to make sense as well. It was like common sense and an alternative. No one had really presented me with an alternative path and said, if you behave in this way, you won't get a hangover, you won't suffer, you won't do really silly things when you're drunk and regret it. You'll just, you'll be happier. So there were 2 quite big things that dropped away early on. And in your own practice of ethics, you'll have different, everybody's path is different. You'll have different things that you will drop away as you deepen your practice. So in a sense that was kind of the start of the path for me. And but ethics, what I could say about the practice of ethics is I think it's, for me, the most important aspect of my practice. People talk about their practice, and often they're talking about meditation, they're talking about their meditation practice. But for me, if I'm talking about my practice, I'm referring to really my ethical practice, because that's, I've not, in a sense, there's a formulation of the path which is ethics, meditation and wisdom. This is another, there's loads of formulations of the path, but it said basically if your meditation isn't very deep and concentrated, you need to focus on ethics. Ethics is the kind of root, the foundation. My meditation often isn't that concentrated or absorbed. Sometimes it is very absorbed and concentrated, but for me the real cutting edge, the real place where I'm working is ethics actually. It's the place where real transformation takes place in the mind. Well, in a way, meditation and ethics go hand in hand. We're working to cultivate new habits on the meditation cushion, but then we're looking to implement those new habits in our relationships with other people and in the world. So ethics really is a cutting edge. Ethics is the cutting edge of my practice. And I suppose what happens is it gets more and more subtler. I suppose I notice myself developing a sharper sense of ethical awareness, I suppose. I became more and more aware of my ethical choices. To begin with, I suppose we're each making choices, lots of choices every moment, every minute with our interactions with people. And as we become, I suppose as you pay more and more attention to ethics, what you notice is there's a choice about how you respond to people. Whether you have the last baked potato, whether you have 2 biscuits or 1 biscuit, whether you offer to make somebody else a drink. They're just kind of day-to-day practical things. And as you start to, you start to notice, you start to get to know your own mind very well. You start to just observe, actually I'm quite selfish a lot of the time. I kind of, I've become more generous. You can start to notice how your mind works in your interactions with people, your relationships with people. So it's not, and ethics isn't something just right at the start of the path. It's not the kind of, the foundation thing which you then leave behind. Ethics, as you deepen your Buddhist practice, you deepen your ethical practice. So as order members, when I was ordained, I didn't then say, okay, I've done the 5 precepts. We were given an extra 5 precepts at ordination, so we practiced 10 ethical precepts at ordination. So the ethical practice again deepens at that stage. So we practice 3 more speech precepts. So as well as truthful speech, we try and speak kindly and avoid harsh speech. We try and speak in a way that's going to benefit people and not in a way that's kind of just frivolous. We try and avoid gossip or kind of malicious speech, and we try and speak harmoniously in a way that's going to create harmony and concord amongst the Sangha. So we also, in terms of mind precepts, we have 3 mind precepts. We try and turn hatred into compassion, ignorance into wisdom, and kind of jealousy, covetousness into contentment. So we've got, in a sense, what happens at ordination is you deepen your practice of ethics. So for me, the Buddhist path is a path of deepening practice of ethics. That's what it's looked like for me, and that's very much what I focus on. Yeah, but just a few things to say really about my practice of ethics, and maybe some difficulties I've had. And one of the difficulties I had when I really got my teeth into Buddhist ethics was I realised for a long time I've been practicing ethics in quite a different way. I was brought up in the Christian tradition, the Catholic tradition, and I was very much into Catholicism when I was a teenager and younger, and I was an altar boy and I read the Bible a lot. And basically, what I realised when I started to practice Buddhist ethics was that I'd brought along a lot of Christian ideas that I'd kind of imbibed about ethics. And one of them was an idea about kind of good and evil, I suppose. And I suppose it's also social ideas about this. I wanted to be good in it, I suppose. I just wanted to be a good Buddhist. I wanted to be a good boy or a good Buddhist. I wanted to be a nice Buddhist. That was kind of my approach to ethics when I first came along. That was the reason, was just I wanted to be a good Buddhist, I suppose. And but then the difficulties come with that is because there's a lot of parts of me that didn't fit in with being a good Buddhist. There's lots of kind of strands to my being, lots of choices I was making which weren't a good Buddhist. And it's, well, what do you do with that? If you've got a really strong focus on wanting to be a good Buddhist, what can happen is you just go into a bit of denial, actually kind of sweep under the carpet all the things that aren't presentable to the outer world or to society. You kind of, in a way, we present a mask almost. We wear a mask to the outside world. This is what I am. This is what I do. I don't know if other people do this, but basically, I'm a good boy. I'm a good Buddhist. I'm a nice Buddhist. But actually, the more and more you practice meditation, the more and more you bring ethical awareness to your actions. In a sense, something's got to shift. Something had to shift for me. And what had to shift was I just had to acknowledge more and more the bits of me that weren't nice actually and aren't a good Buddhist, and get into a different kind of relationship about that, because the relationship I had got was loads of shame, loads of kind of irrational guilt, and it was just necessary to change my relationship to the different strands of myself. The term that's used in Buddhism is unskillfulness. We don't have the terms. We don't usually use the terms good and evil. We more use the terms skillful action and unskillful action, or you could say wise action or unwise action. And I think I'd intellectually got the idea that kind of we're making skillful choices and I'm getting more wise and I'm going to make better choices. But actually, what I brought along emotionally was a sense, I'm really bad, or I'm a really bad Buddhist if I acknowledge this part of me. I suppose I brought along a lot of ideas that weren't particularly related to Buddhist ethics, and it took a lot of time to kind of sort out with my practice of ethics what Buddhist ethics is really about, actually. And what Buddhist ethics is really about is about changing your mind, actually changing your volitions, changing your mind to become who you could really be, actually, to start to be acting in line with your highest potential. So this list of the 5 precepts, or the 10 precepts, represents the behaviour of an enlightened being, actually, the natural, spontaneous behaviour of somebody who's just deeply wise and deeply compassionate, how they would just respond to the world. And so the practice of ethics isn't about being good or stopping being bad, it's about becoming the person you could really be, starting to live by your deepest potential. And also, conveniently, it makes you happier. It's about relieving suffering and deepening happiness and liberation. So that's Buddhist ethics isn't about becoming good or stopping being bad. It's about becoming the person you could be. So we've got these words, kind of holy and pure, and I suppose in my kind of pre-Buddhist upbringing, those words meant being a nice Buddhist, being a good boy, I suppose, being holy and pure meant those things. But actually, the real root of those words, the real meaning of those words, to become pure means to be not diluted. For your being to become pure means to become powerful, actually, to become a being whose intentions and volitions are not diluted. And the word wholeness, wholesomeness, it's about, again, having a wholeness to our being, so a being that isn't kind of scattered and diverse, but is quite potent and powerful. And the way we do that is over time. It's so that we've got all these different strands of our beings. We've got some strands of our beings that are loving and are generous and are content and want to tell the truth, and we've got lots of other strands that aren't interested in those kind of things. And it's as though our energy and our being just gets kind of diluted and dissipated. For us to become really who we could be and to become in line with our truest potential. The practice of ethics is really, it's about kind of gathering ourselves, becoming kind of a potent being who can really wholeheartedly act in line with their values. So, ideally, to begin with, we recognise that these values are worth living by. It's worth living by these 5 precepts and trying to live by them. But then we need to become wholehearted and kind of gather the different parts of ourselves behind these principles. And that's the route, that's the path to awakening, actually, the path to enlightenment is becoming really more and more wholehearted, a more and more kind of potent mind that can decide to live by these precepts. So this is the law of karma. What I'm talking about is the law of karma. The law of karma says basically what we do now, the actions we live by now, will decide in a way who we become in the future. We make choices now, and those choices either deepen certain habits or strengthen certain habits, the certain strands of our being, or they kind of loosen and we take energy away from certain strands and put them behind other strands of our being. That's what the law of karma really means. So through the law of karma we can become the person we really could be. So we could live by our values, and what would that be like, just to always be able to live by our values wholeheartedly. So that's what the path of ethics is really about for me. And it starts really just about becoming honest, and this principle of truthfulness and awareness, they're really important. Just starting to become honest with ourselves and more aware of just what we're really like. Actually, what is our current position? I want to be a nice boy or a good Buddhist, but actually what is going on? I'd like to be the kind of person who will let somebody else have the last baked potato, but what's the real situation? What's really happening? So we bring more and more awareness to our behaviour. We start to notice more and more the choices we habitually make, and then we can start to change them. But it starts by just, in a way, admitting to ourselves and admitting to other people, the current situation. And that takes some courage. Actually, it took me some courage, because I had such a real strong fear of disapproval, people disapproving of me if they really knew what I was like, what I really got up to in the kind of privacy of my own mind, and I could present a kind of metaphor-worn Buddhist, but if other people knew what was going on in my mind, would they still like me? Would they still approve of me? And basically what I discovered is actually they liked me more. When I opened up and I told them, because in a way your friends know you often better than you know yourself. Your friends, I'm just starting to notice habits about myself that my friends have just been really patiently putting up with for the past few years, and it's just it's a relief to them that I've noticed it. And I can now do something about it. So, the fear is that I'll be disapproved and I'll be kind of shunned. And I had a really strong fear of that just before my ordination. We went through quite a rigorous period of just confession, just kind of drawing up all the things we regretted and letting go of them. And I had this real primordial fear really of being rejected. And what actually happened was the opposite. Just the more I've got used to doing this, just to open it up to people I can trust, people I know will receive it well. There's just a closer connection. I've taken down this barrier, I've taken off this mask that I'm wearing to the world, and what happens is there's a closer connection, a much better relationship, deeper trust. And actually it opens the door for them to say, well, actually, I do that as well. Or, I've done that in the past, or this is what I'm really worried about, this is what I'm holding. So, it's quite exhilarating to practice ethics in a community with friends quite deeply. It can be quite exhilarating and really moving, actually, just to kind of share the deepest parts of yourselves with people that will really hear it and hear it with kindness, and they want the best from you. So there's a lot of courage involved in the practice of ethics. But maybe just to sum up, for me, ethics is the root practice. It's the most important practice for me. And I just recognise I've got so much ground to cover for this lifetime, at least in ethics. It's going to keep me busy for at least this lifetime, probably a few more lifetimes practicing ethics. But basically, it's not. Ethics isn't about being good. And there's a book which I've told is very good called "It's Not About Being Good." And ethics isn't about being good, it's about becoming happier in a way, causing less harm to the world, to the people around you, less harm to yourself. And it's about becoming really the person that you are, the person that you could really be. It's about, starting to be more and more living by the values that you hold dear and becoming more and more the person that you could be. And and if you are interested in what it means to become a mitra and take that step of deciding to live by the 5 precepts, then you could speak to one of us at a tea break or at some point. So that's the practice of ethics, and I think next we're going to have Kate speaking about Virya.
Okay, so Virya. So I'm going to talk about Virya. So Virya is energy, but it's not just any old energy. So Virya is energy in pursuit of the good, so in pursuit of what's beneficial, in pursuit of enlightenment. So I chose to talk about Virya because when I think about it, actually, Virya is the main drive of my practice. I think Virya is mainly what I focus on, or it seems, when I was thinking about it, I thought, well, I could just talk about Virya for hours. So I shan't, but there is plenty to say. So I've managed to kind of condense what I wanted to say into just a couple of areas. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about Virya in terms of applying effort, so the sorts of willful efforts that I make in my practice, where I put my energies. And then also I'd like to say a bit about the source of energy that I use and how I've had to work with that over my Buddhist career. So the first area is about how I apply effort in my practice. And I think I apply a lot of effort to my practice, actually. I do have a lot of energy, I think. And I think one of the main ways that I apply this energy is trying to stay in the gap. So you probably all remember the gap from your beginners courses. So you have your experience of the world, where you come into contact with something. And then you have a response, which is either wanting to push it away or pull it towards you. And there's the gap. So the gap is whether you choose to do something different to what your normal response would be. So it takes a lot of effort to stay in the gap. So when I first came to the Buddhist Centre, like everyone here, I'm sure, I had my own wonderful selection of stories and thoughts that I indulged in, which held me back, and causing me suffering, causing everyone around me suffering. And I think I'd experienced quite a lot of suffering in my life. So I'd often been depressed, behaved in lots of ways that were damaging for me, and I'd ended up with chronic fatigue syndrome. So when I came here, first of all, I was very ill, actually, with chronic fatigue. And so one of the things I loved about coming here is I immediately discovered that Buddhism says, yes, there is suffering in life, and also you don't have to suffer quite so much. And here are some tools to help you not suffer so much. I was like, oh my God, thank you. So I was so relieved. So I had a lot of motivation to engage with the practices that I was taught here. So I was always quite highly motivated to practice. But what I immediately noticed was how hard it is. You say, you need to start taking responsibility for your mind and what you do with it. But it's just not that simple, is it? Because, you like what you do with your mind, otherwise you wouldn't have been doing it for all that time. So, so I had to start making a bit of effort. And, and what I've noticed as I've observed my mind over the last sort of 7 or 8 years is that actually I like my stories. It's not just, people say, oh, you hold on to your stories because they shore up your sense of self and because you're very, what else have I written down here that people say about it? But actually my experience of it is that I want those stories. Like, they're like a big security blanket that I want to hold on to. This is what my life is like. This is true. And I want to believe these things. Even things that are quite damaging. They're my stories and they make sense of my life. And I want them. It's almost a bit like being intoxicated. I'm a bit intoxicated by my own stories. And I don't want to let go of them. So it takes, sometimes I feel like I'm it's taking every shred of my willpower to stay in the gap. And often, particularly recently, I've been having a bit of a bumpy time, and I feel like that's how it's been for me recently, is that often every moment is staying in the gap, and that's all I can do. And I wasn't actually going to talk about this, but because that's been happening for me recently, I decided to talk about it. So a big example for me around this is sort of a tendency to nihilism and nihilistic thought. So that's a sort of style of thinking where you think, you know, after you die, there's nothing, everything's pointless, nobody's connected, and actions have no consequences. So that's a big sort of set of stories for me. And so, you know, when I indulge in that sort of thinking, well, the result is inevitable, really. You know, I end up being really miserable and depressed, feeling quite cut off from everybody else, and believing that connection is impossible, which is really painful for me and for everybody around me. So, so I've been working with that a lot recently. So it takes a lot of effort to, first of all, notice the thoughts arising. And then when I notice the thoughts arising, label them as nihilistic thoughts and untrue. And then when I've done that, to not indulge in them. So the beginning of the Dhammapada talks about those who entertain such thoughts, you know, the idea of entertaining thoughts which are unhelpful. And I've got this image of, you know, you have this big party and you have your thoughts around for it, you give them a drink, sit down, have a chair, you know. And I really think I really want to do that with my negative thoughts. I want to entertain them. So just trying not to entertain my thoughts and instead just to sort of show them the door, but quite kindly, you know, as kindly as I can. So, you know, for example, if I notice thoughts arising that, you know, it's impossible to connect with people, there's no point to anything, you know, well, there's an array of things that I can do instead of just entertaining those thoughts. I might choose to speak to a spiritual friend, thus proving that connection is in fact possible. Might choose to do the metta bhavana. I might even choose to do something like go for a drive and try and let people out. So something which is connecting. Or I might go and see if there's anyone washing that I can hang out in the community. So I try to find ways to connect with other people when my thoughts are telling me that connection is impossible, because that's a wrong view. So there's something I can do to counteract it by embracing what is in fact real. So, just turn over. Yeah, so I mean, it's hard work and I don't always manage it, but it's a project I'm wholeheartedly engaged in, and it does bear fruit, I've noticed. So as well as staying in the gap, a related thing which I put a lot of effort into is putting myself in good conditions. So being in good conditions is really important. It's hard to practice a spiritual life, and it's impossible in bad conditions, for me at least. So, you know, for example, I've got this story about it being impossible to connect with people, which is very painful. And that leads me into feeling like I can't really get into difficult communications with people, because once I do, if we fall out, they'll never talk to me again, they'll hate me because communication's impossible. So left to my own devices, I wouldn't really engage, I think, and I'd have quite superficial relationships with people, and that's very painful. So actually, I put myself in conditions where I can't do that. I don't get away with it. So I live in community, which means I live with my Buddhist friends, where I have to engage. I work in team-based right livelihood, where I work with my Buddhist friends, and I have to engage. And then I come here, and I see my Buddhist friends, and I have to engage. And I just can't get away with it. And so being in those conditions erodes those stories, it erodes that sense of isolation, and it's made it much more possible for me to move towards people. I've seen it eroding those thoughts. The other thing about being in such good Sangha supportive conditions is that the Sangha understand what I'm trying to do. So they forgive me when I don't get it right, they forgive me when I make mistakes, and they support me. But they don't let me get away with it. You know, they tell me the effect I'm having on them, you know. We understand, and also this is painful for us. And that's been really important. And I've just driven Terry off to be ordained today. She left Sheffield. She's one of my gurus in this respect. You know, I've benefited so much from her courage in giving me that sort of feedback over the years, and it's just utterly transformed me. I owe her a great debt of gratitude. So a little bit about sort of the sort of effort that I've applied. So I've always been a bit pushy and a bit willful all in my life, and most of the time you can get away with that, but not in the spiritual life, sadly. And when I first came to Buddhism, I was, there's this beautiful image of the Buddhist path, like a lotus blossoming naturally, and you just put the soil in and you give it nutrition stuff, whatever you do with plants, and then they grow beautifully. And that's sort of the ideal model. And then my model was a bit more like, you get this flower and you're sort of trying to yank it out of the pot and sort of peel the petals open very quickly. That was very much how I was practicing. And I've had to use quite a lot of effort to stop myself making that sort of effort, which might sound a bit of a paradox. An example of this, for me, very big example, is my meditation practice. So when I started meditating, to be honest, I didn't like it that much, but I did it anyway, and that was fine. But then once I started to get into meditation, and I started to understand about, what you do when getting into dhyana and all that, and I started to get a bit impatient with my meditation experience. I thought it was a bit uninteresting and boring, and I wanted something a bit more interesting and less boring. I also experienced a lot of pretty, so I had lots of energy, lots of coarse energy, unintegrated energies that always would bubble up when I sat to meditate, that were really distracting and annoying, and I'd just start to get concentrated, and then my body would go, and I'd be like, oh God, start again. So I just got really fed up. So I decided I was going to apply some effort. So what that really meant was I started trying to cut off the parts of my experience that were inconvenient to me and repress my coarser energies. Is that 10? So unsurprisingly, after a period of doing this, I started to get an enormous headache every time I sat down to meditate. Then I started to get an enormous headache every time I thought about meditating. And then I started to get an enormous headache every time I thought about doing anything to do with Buddhism. So my entire being completely rebels against this willful attitude to practice. It just doesn't work. So this view that it should be like this or it should be like that doesn't work. So So really humiliating, really, coming in and supporting the beginners classes and seeing all the beginners sort of sitting there having lovely meditations while I have been a Buddhist for 7 years and I couldn't meditate. Really humiliating. So I've had to learn to meditate all over again from the beginning with a completely different attitude and a completely different sort of energy that I apply in my meditation, which is much softer and much more gentle and much more kind and much more imbued with metta. I didn't really have any of that before, I don't think. And I wasn't even aware that I didn't even have it. So it's been a big journey, and it's a journey which is still in progress for me. So Amoghamaxa's got a great phrase, which is, I think, is it your phrase? It's Buddhism, not shouldism. It's become a bit of a mantra for me. If I ever notice a should creeping into any aspect of my Buddhist practice, it's a big flashing alarm bell goes off now. So, particularly in meditation. And I've sort of been reflecting that if there isn't metta in my experience, it's likely that whatever it is I'm engaging in isn't for the good, isn't in pursuit of the good anyway. So that's become more of a priority for me. So there's a bit of, I suppose, a theme running through what I've been saying tonight to do with Virya is that my journey, I suppose, has been one where I've learned and continue to learn more, actually, that a well-lived Dharma life for me doesn't need to look like anything in particular, nor does it need to look like skipping about in beautifully positive, happy mental states the whole time, It just might not look like that. If I'm living the Dharma life effectively, it involves me turning towards my experience with courage more fully and trying not to block any of my experience, and making a consistent effort to work as effectively as I can with whatever is going on in my mind then and there. And that is all I can reasonably expect of myself. And if metta isn't present there, then I'm probably not doing that. So metta. And to do that requires a lot of energy and a lot of virya. But I think I have seen the fruit that has emerged from applying virya so far in my practice, and I do have a lot of faith that if I continue applying the same amount of virya, more fruits will emerge, and that the lotus, rather than yanking the lotus out of the pot, it will just blossom naturally and in its own time, and will be much more beautiful as a result.
Okay, so the paramita that I'm going to talk about is the fifth one, meditation, or as we call it in Sanskrit, the samadhi or dhyana paramita. And these are two words that, strictly speaking, refer to these sorts of heightened states of consciousness that we can experience through meditation, rather than the methodology of meditation itself. And these heightened states of consciousness are seen as absolutely key in the development of the sixth paramita, prajna, or transcendental wisdom, which means a really clear and direct seeing into the nature of reality. But unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about these heightened states of consciousness for two reasons. Sorry to let you down. So firstly, samadhi or dhyana is by its very nature very, very difficult to talk about using the words and concepts of our thinking minds. And in fact, we're trying to do so. It's quite easy to pass on all sorts of really unhelpful views about meditation. Notably, a goal-oriented approach to meditation in which these sorts of altered states of consciousness become, they're chased in order to tick them off the list, achievements to be gained. And another one is this pleasure-oriented approach to meditation, in which we pursue these states for the pleasant sensations they can bring us. And I'm absolutely guilty at various times in my meditation career of taking both approaches. And I can tell you, with conviction, they represent absolute dead ends in the practice of meditation. Because both of them arise from and really reinforce the egotism that as Dharma practitioners, perhaps even as aspiring bodhisattvas, we should be striving to avoid. And the second reason for me not talking about these states of consciousness is that for most of us, myself included, this is not where our everyday experience of meditation is at. So the central teaching of Buddhism, pratitya samutpada, or condition co-production, teaches us that all things arise as a result of conditions. And for most of us, the conditions of our everyday lives just are not conducive to the arising of refined states of consciousness. And that's why it's really, really important for us to go on retreat. So our busy and demanding lives lead to a lot of mental turbulence, which exists in our minds as hindrances to the experiencing of this sort of quiet, refined, still mental states that we call samadhi or dhyana. And certainly for me, meditation is about working with these far more everyday, much more unappealing states of mind. And the process of moving towards perfection in meditation, whatever that means, begins somewhere much more humble amongst this sort of turbulent, unappealing, deluded set of mental states. So I'm going to focus on meditation in a much, much more everyday sense. But what I'm also not going to do is talk about the how of meditation. What you should be doing in meditation, or what your meditation should look like. So more should-isms rather than Buddhisms. So for one thing, I've not got anywhere near the level of experience needed to teach meditation to others. But I also really believe that meditation is a deeply personal experience, and that beyond being given quite a basic toolkit, it's up to us to deepen our practice and experience of meditation through regular, diligent practice in communication with other people. So instead of talking about the how of meditation, I'm going to talk about something that I think is equally, if not more important, the why. Why meditate? I think, this is a question I ask myself quite a lot actually, particularly when I'm getting out of bed at 6 in the morning. And I think it's a question that is really, really crucial for us to grapple with, particularly in the early stages of our meditation careers, and especially if our practice is going to be sustained enough to be of real benefit to us. So whatever perfection in meditation looks like,
We need to have really, really clear motivations which arise out of a clear understanding of why meditation is a valuable thing to do. So this is the question I'm going to focus on for the rest of this short talk, outlining my personal answer to this question of why meditate, in the hope that some of it will resonate with you. And I'm going to approach this question in 3 ways: through the self, through the other, and through the mystery. So firstly, the self. For many of us, I think the initial motivation in learning to meditate is the perceived benefit that it will have to ourselves and our experience. We might want to be calmer, stiller, more content. We might want a way to work with our stress and anxiety, our moods, our tendency to anger, our disappointments, our frustrations. And certainly this was what got me first involved in wanting to meditate. And over time, my experience shows me that this is the case. I can verify that. Mindfulness seems like this increasingly modern panacea. It's used everywhere nowadays in all sorts of therapeutic settings, backed up by all sorts of scientific evidence. And traditional meditation practices, like the mindfulness of breathing, give us a means not only to be with our experience more deeply, but to be able to step back from it and see through all of the affects and thought processes that keep us hostage in the midst of unmindfulness. And this is the famous gap that Bodhinaga has already spoken about, being which allows us to move from a position of reactivity that lies at the roots of so much of our suffering towards one of creativity, working with our minds and our actions in a far more creative way that brings us into a healthier and happier relationship with the world. And certainly for me, a large part of the reason why I began to meditate and continue to meditate is that it brings many benefits to me in terms of my personal well-being. So in particular, it helps me to manage the stresses of quite a demanding job and to respond with more creativity to difficult situations when they arise. But my experience also tells me that this benefit to oneself is not enough in answering the question of why meditate. And I think that part of the reason why my early meditation career was so patchy was because myself was my sole motivation. So when I received the benefits of regular meditation practice, I started to feel less stressed, more content. I just stopped meditating. And then, of course, the cycle would begin again. So I go through the cycle of meditation, calm, getting stressed again, stopping meditating, and so on and so forth. And I think this represented a real stagnation in my well-being, but also in my spiritual practice and development. And it took me a while to realise that I was placing limits on the potential that meditation has to transform by viewing it only as something that would be a benefit to myself. And I think that in order for meditation to really help us unfold to our truest potential, that represented by the Bodhisattvas and their practice of the Paramitas, we must widen our perspective. So this brings me on to talking about others. I think that if we're going to sustain a meditation practice, or at least one that is truly growthful and satisfying, we must reflect on the benefits that it brings not only to ourselves but to other people, and incorporate these into these reflections into our motivations for practicing. And this isn't to say that we shouldn't seek out and enjoy the benefits that meditation brings to ourselves. But if meditation is ultimately just about me and my mental states, it just becomes this exercise in self-referential self-improvement that can actually just end up strengthening rather than softening these mental barriers that we set up between ourselves and other people. And of course the Dharma teaches us that it's this separation between self and others that lies at the root of a lot of our dissatisfaction and suffering. In fact, I think that meditation viewed in the right way is a really powerful tool for challenging this worldview, as I'm sure a lot of us have experienced through our practice, particularly of the Metta Bhavana. And I think reflecting on how our meditation practice might be of benefit to others is a really important part of challenging this worldview. So I find this particularly useful in those many dry periods in my meditation practice when it feels like I'm not getting much back out, either in terms of enjoyment or visible benefit to myself. So for example, I might find myself spending half an hour doing the Metta Bhavana and actually feeling quite uncomfortable with the experience. But through reflecting on the fact that other people might benefit from me being a little less sharp with them, a little more kind, I can find the motivation that I need to sit through these difficulties as they arise. And similarly, this focus on others can be important for me when I feel like my meditation is going well. Yeah, it reminds me not to rest on my laurels, and sort of softens that almost inevitable fall from grace that seems to happen when meditation seems to be, going as we want it to. And a particular way that I do this is that I recite the transference of merit at the end of every sit that I do, especially the good ones. Yeah, being explicit in sharing the benefits of my practice with others. May the merit gained in my acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. And this really helps me to stay grounded in my practice and just counteracts this tendency to slip into self-referentiality. And there's a lot more that I could say about how in thinking about the why of meditation, it's important to be thinking about others. I could talk about the relationship between meditation and mindfulness and ethics. I could talk about how every time we meditate, we make the world just a little bit more of an enlightened place, and that our meditation is just a small part of a bigger shared project of not just improving the little world that we inhabit in our minds, but the wider world around us. But I've glossed over these things because there's something else that I want to talk about before I finish this short talk. A motivation that when I really reflect on things, I think runs a lot deeper for me than either the self or the other. That's something a lot more mysterious. So we might begin our meditation career sitting for the benefits that it brings to ourselves. But at some point we might really realise how this can limit and cramp us. And it keeps us locked inside this stuffy little cage called the self. And so we might begin meditating more explicitly for the sake of others. But ultimately I think meditation transcends either of these things. They're both important and both have their place. But the more that I meditate, the more that I feel that what keeps me coming back to the cushion is something altogether different. And there's a quote from Sangha, from the founder of our movement, that has just been whizzing around my mind while I've been preparing for this talk, and very frustratingly I haven't been able to track down. So I haven't got the exact quote or reference, but I'd like to make mention of it anyway. And it goes something like, "Not for oneself, nor even for others, should one practice the Dharma, but simply and solely for its own irresistible sake." Yeah. Simply and solely for its own irresistible sake. And for me, this really goes to the heart of why I meditate. There's just something irresistible about this experience that I can't really adequately describe, but just pulls me forward. It's like I feel that even amidst the humdrum distractions and frustrations of my everyday mind, I'm standing on the edge of something enormous. Yeah, like there's something really beautiful and unknown just in the corner of my vision, that I know it's there even though it disappears when I turn and try to look at it. And this other, not in the sense of other people, but something altogether other from the mundaneness of this world, the mundaneness of my view of it at least. This is what keeps me meditating. So I turn inwards to look at myself and my experience simply and solely for its own irresistible sake. So just to be in my experience without thought of benefit to myself or to other people, of progress to be made or attainments to grasp, but just to be in my experience, standing on the edge of this vast something. That for me answers the why of meditation. Just because. Yeah, standing in the face of what for me is the greatest of all questions, without needing to have an answer. Just trying to be with my unknowingness, my uncertainty, my groundlessness, without fear, without prejudice. And that's really why I meditate. So, that's it.